When I was in high school, I was really into photography. My dream was to get hired as a photojournalist by a major media company. So I was up to doing just about anything to get some good pictures. One night, I went to an abandoned psych ward to grab a few nighttime pictures from there. The place had been closed down for about 3 years, but after talking to my friend who'd already explored there, he offered to go with me. I met him at his house, and he drove us there. The old psych ward was scheduled to be demolished within the next month, so I wanted to capture some memories of the building that was once inhabited by so many people, before it became a pile of debris. The building was notorious for being haunted, but neither myself or my friend really believed in the paranormal. When we arrived, we parked the car in front of the house that was a couple blocks down from the building to avoid being spotted when the police did their nighttime patrols. My friend led the way, and I followed behind, very excited, but also a little nervous. As we walked along the fence towards the building, I noticed that the building definitely had an eerie vibe to it. It was a giant, massive darkness, standing in the middle of the night, and no one but ourselves knew where we were. Once we reached a certain point, my friend and I hopped the fence, and began walking across the grass to the emergency side door entrance that was supposedly unlocked. I really didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but as soon as the creaky door swung open, I was blasted with damp and musty air as we walked inside. It reeked of urine and bleach, and it stung our nostrils. We flipped on our flashlights, and began walking down the long and dark hallway. The building was not in great shape by any means, with holes all over the walls and floors, in addition to the hanging wires from the ceiling. I took a few pictures of the first floor wing and a couple of the other rooms, and even found some old drawings from what I assumed to be the patients from the psych ward. It was definitely a really creepy place, but we were having a great time. We even found the old elevator that was totally destroyed on the inside, but it made for some great shots. Shortly after, we found the stairwell that would lead to the basement, and although hesitant, we went down. Now, I really wasn't scared on the first floor, but the basement was really creepy. Everything was pitch black, and it seemed like our flashlights weren't even able to illuminate more than a few feet ahead of us. As we slowly made our way down one side of the hallway, we found a room that was labeled boiler room. I tried the door handle, and after a little pushing, it opened. Inside were ancient-looking mechanical machines that I'd never seen before. There were also several boxes along the wall of what looked to be old electrical equipment, but the wires were all ripped apart and hanging. After a couple pictures, we made our way down to the next room labeled storage. Inside were old hospital beds with leather straps coming out of the sides of the cart. It was exactly what I imagined. Some of the straps had teeth marks in them, and parts of the cart were badly scratched or broken, making me wonder what really happened to it. It was a pretty chilling sight, until we were interrupted by a loud crash from somewhere in the basement. We both froze, trying to hone in on where the sound came from, but it was impossible to tell from the empty hallways that echoed with the sound of anything. My friend walked out of the room with his flashlight and yelled, "Hello?" I tensed up as we waited for a response, wishing he hadn't said anything in the first place. That's when I really started to get scared, so I ran out into the hallway next to him and told him I wanted to leave. Then out of nowhere, we heard another noise again. This time it sounded like a bunch of metal tools had been knocked over, and we were able to tell which end of the hallway it came from, and we pointed our flashlights down the hallway. With the darkness engulfing the beam of the light, it wasn't much help. Suddenly, I was able to hear footsteps around the other end of the building, and unless it was my imagination, it sounded like they were getting closer. Without much time to stand around, we made our way up the stairs to the first floor as soon as we started heading towards the exit at the end of the hallway. I heard a loud growling sound coming directly below us. I don't know how to put it, but it sounded like a loud grunt of frustration. We eventually got back to his car, and with our hearts pounding, we were speechless. I don't know who was down there that night, and I'm glad I never found out. I was relieved to get home. But that all changed when I woke up the next morning. As I was just about to walk out the door, I walked past my dad as he was watching the news. When I looked at the TV, I completely froze in my steps. The headline of the news was that the old psych ward was burned down last night, just hours after we left. Obviously not wanting to tell my dad I was just there, I walked out of the door and left for school, in total disbelief. Although I got some great pictures that night, it still deeply disturbs me that someone was down there with us the entire time, and we were oblivious to it all. It could be a crazy coincidence, but deep down, I know it wasn't. It was late July when I was hanging out with my friend and a couple of our other friends at his house for the night. We were having a campfire in his backyard, drinking some beers. My friend is a 2-year-old golden retriever named Steve, who just so happens to share the name of his owner. Anyway, Steve the dog was hanging out with us as we sat around and talking. He always likes playing fetch, so I was throwing his frisbee across the ridiculously big backyard. The grass extended back about 75 yards, where there was a strip of woods in between the houses on the other street. As I was playing fetch with Steve, he started barking like crazy in the direction of the house behind the woods. He wouldn't listen to us, but rather stood there growling, snarling, and barking at seemingly nothing. After a couple of minutes, Steve came back to us with this frisbee like normal, almost like he completely forgot about what he was barking at in the first place. It was definitely out of character for him, given that we never heard bark once in our lives. We sort of forgot about it, going back to talking about whatever it was we were talking about before. A few minutes later, Steve the owner stopped what he was saying in the middle of his sentence and stared towards the woods. We all turned back and looked to confusion, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. That's when Steve told us that the house behind him was abandoned. That got me thinking there was a faint, yellow light shining through the window of the first floor. That was definitely not on previously. He went on to explain that the house was recently damaged in a fire, and the family moved out afterward. We were spooked, but definitely interested, and since there were 4 of us, we decided to finish off our beers and check it out. We're pretty big guys, and could definitely fend for ourselves, but Steve brought his BB gun just in case anything happened. Then we made our way through the woods to the backyard of the house. As we walked closer to the back door, I noticed that the house had an in-ground pool. The water looked dark green and muggy, definitely giving off the impression that no one lived there. We quietly tried the back door, but it was locked. We made our way around to the front of the house, checking to make sure there weren't any neighbors watching. Then tried the door handle on the front door. It was unlocked. Steve stepped inside first, pointing his BB gun as we closely followed behind. The first impression I got of the inside was creepy to say the least. Many of the walls were black, after being burnt by the fire. A couple of the windows were shattered either from the fire itself or intruders. But again, we were also technically intruders. Parts of the floor were burnt to a crisp, so we had to be extra cautious of where we were stepping. There was no furniture in what seemed to be the living room area, but everything was still faintly illuminated from the light in the other room. As soon as I stepped in the room with the light, I can now make out that it was the kitchen. The source of the light was coming from a flashlight, but it was sitting inside of the sink. It was definitely weird, but that wasn't what freaked me out the most. The window was a perfect view of Steve's backyard, so whoever put that flashlight there definitely would have been able to see us sitting around the fire. It was almost like they purposely left the flashlight, knowing we'd be able to see. That's when Steve had a brilliant idea of checking out the basement, which was definitely not what I wanted to do, especially after just coming to that realization. He opened the burnt basement door, and I pulled out my iPhone flashlight to see what was down there. Everything was completely burned to a crisp, and the stairs were definitely not functional. It doesn't take a fireman to know that the source of the fire started in the basement. Relieved, I closed the door and followed Steve as we all walked up the seemingly undamaged stairs to the upper level of the house at the top. Everything was in perfect condition, so the fire must have been put out before it reached the second floor. I started to realize that the decrepit house was once a really nice home to a family. There were 5 rooms upstairs, and it actually had a similar layout to Steve's. As we checked the first room, everything was totally quiet until we heard something that caught us off guard. There was music coming from one of the other rooms. It wasn't loud at all, but definitely loud enough for us to all hear. Steve stormed out of the room as the rest of us followed, as we tried to narrow down the source of the sound. It was coming from the last hallway on the left, but the door was closed. "Who's there?" pointing his BB gun. But after scanning the room, nothing was there, except for a Bluetooth speaker, sitting on the floor in the middle of the room. The one spot we hadn't checked was the closet, certain that we'd find someone inside. We started yelling for the person to come out. However, the door never moved, so that was our cue to open it up ourselves. As the door ripped open, I was shocked to find out that it was completely empty. The build-up to opening that door was enough to freak us out. So we made our way to the stairs to leave. As soon as we got out of the house, we looked at each other in disbelief, as we made our way around towards the backyard to go home. I kept looking behind us, seeing the flashlight light up the kitchen through the window. I turned back around, confused, and definitely a little creeped out. That's when my other friend turned to us. "Dude, someone's looking out the window on the second floor." I turned, completely shocked that he wasn't just messing with us. There was a silhouette of a person staring at us. In the same room, we found the speaker. Steve suggested we should go back, but none of us were up for that, so we continued through the woods back to his house. It almost felt like whoever was inside that house purposely lured us out there. They had a clear view of us the whole time, and definitely would have seen us coming in the first place. I'm not sure why the person hid from us. Maybe it was just to scare us, or maybe they didn't expect there to be four of us. Our only guess is that the person hid in the attic when they saw us coming, since we had pretty much checked everywhere except for the attic. But again, that's just speculation. I'm not sure if anything would have turned out different if there had only been two of us, but I'm glad I'll never have to find out. Back when I used to work in the hospitality business, one of the best jobs I ever had was being a housekeeper at a hotel in my city. And I know that might sound a little odd, but it was a really easy job for the most part. There was one instance, though, that was well out of my job description that I most likely never be able to forget. It was during my last year working at the hotel. I was going about my usual job, which mainly included walking from room to room with my cart, and making sure that everything was ready for the new guest to arrive. An empty room got checked and any room that needed cleaning got taken care of, and in no time at all I was on my first 15-minute break of the shift. I made my way down to the manager to let her know that I was taking my break. I remember walking past a room that was particularly loud, and I remember thinking to myself that it wouldn't be long before security got to tell them to keep things quiet. But after that I forgot about that room entirely, and proceeded to go on my break. I spoke to my boss, she just sort of brushed it off and told me to go on my break, then got back to what she was doing. She looked particularly busy, so I decided not to bother her any more than I needed to. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside for a cigarette. By the time I came back in, my manager had calmed down a bit, so I asked her what was going on, thinking that we might have a busy night on our hands, but it wasn't anything like that. The night shift guard Ben had called out, and she was looking for someone to cover for him. I told her to try to call Michael and that he would probably be available, and then I went back to my shift. However, less than an hour after I got back to work, I got a call on my radio asking me if I would do my manager a huge favor. Apparently, she had gotten a hold of Michael and he was going to come in. But he wouldn't have been to the hotel for another 15 minutes or so, and she needed someone to tell a few guests to quiet down right away. I knew the room that she was talking about and thinking nothing of it. So I accepted the job, and it didn't seem like a big deal to me. I double-checked the room number that I had to go to and began making my way there. As soon as I started getting close, I could hear the same sort of rowdy yelling that I heard earlier in my shift, and I proceeded to knock on the door. Silence fell over the room as I announced myself, and said that we had a noise complaint. When I heard the door beginning to open, I expected an irate guest at most, but what I ended up seeing was much worse. A grown man swung the door open and he was clearly intoxicated. He opened the door wider than he planned to, and quickly corrected it by closing the door until I could just barely see his face. But it was too late. Inside the room, I could see that he was in there with another man, and two young girls that looked like they might have been my sister's age. She was 12 at the time. The man tried to act calm, and he asked me what I was there for, and I replied by letting him know that we had gotten a noise complaint, and I'm not sure why I did it, but something in my head told me to ask him, hey, what they were doing here. He and his friend didn't like that though. Instead of getting a response from the man who answered the door, he opened it more, and then pulled me into the room. I didn't have time to react. Before I knew it, I was on the floor looking up at the two men who were now attacking me. I couldn't make out much of what was being said as I covered my head with my arms to shield it from any major blows. Thankfully, the attack came to an end shortly after it started when Michael showed up. He ended up getting to the hotel sooner than expected, and our manager asked him to come and check out the noise complaint. Unlike myself, Michael was an ex-police officer and was certified to carry a firearm. So once he showed up, he was able to apprehend both of the men until the cops arrived. Both men ended up being arrested for apparently grooming the two children on MySpace and luring them out to the hotel. Both of the girls were fairly intoxicated by the time we had gotten there. Who knows what would have happened if we had not gotten that noise complaint and Michael hadn't shown up.